"Sit down." Principal Carver's voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and commanding. Aaliyah hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest as she stood frozen in the doorway of the principal's office. The walls seemed to close in around her, the room sterile and suffocating. The smell of old coffee mixed with the faint tang of disinfectant. She clutched her backpack strap tightly, her knuckles white, trying to steady herself. "What did I do?" she asked, her voice trembling but steady enough to convey the slightest edge of defiance. Principal Carver didn't look up from the stack of papers on his desk. He was a tall, thin man with a receding hairline and sharp features that seemed permanently set in an expression of disapproval. He finally raised his head, his cold blue eyes meeting hers. "That attitude won't help you here," he said, his tone oozing with superiority. He gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Sit." Reluctantly, Aaliyah sat down, feeling small under his gaze. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. She glanced around, her eyes landing on the school crest framed on the wall. "Excellence through order." "Do you know why you're here?" Carver asked, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the desk. "No," she said firmly, holding his gaze despite the growing lump in her throat. He leaned back, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "Zero tolerance policy," he said slowly, enunciating every syllable like it was a lesson she was too slow to learn. "What does that even mean?" Aaliyah asked, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "I didn't do anything." Carver raised an eyebrow, his smirk fading into a scowl. "Watch your tone, young lady. This is exactly the kind of behavior that leads to consequences." "What behavior?" Aaliyah shot back, her voice rising despite herself. "You're not even telling me what I supposedly did." Carver opened a folder and slid a paper across the desk toward her. "Care to explain this?" Aaliyah picked up the paper, her hands shaking slightly. It was a printout of a blurry photo, supposedly of her in a heated argument with another student. Her brow furrowed as she studied it. The image was unclear, her face barely discernible, but Carver didn't seem to care. "This isn't me," she said, her voice firm now, anger replacing fear. "This could be anyone." Carver snorted, leaning forward again. "Don't play dumb, Aaliyah. We've had complaints about you before. Disruptive, argumentative, a bad influence on other students." Aaliyah's jaw dropped. "That's not true. Enough." Carver slammed his hand on the desk, cutting her off. The sound echoed in the small office, making her flinch. "We don't tolerate this kind of behavior at my school. You've crossed the line too many times." Aaliyah's mind raced. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She thought about her mom, about how hard she worked to keep Aaliyah in this prestigious school, about all the late nights Aaliyah spent studying to prove she belonged here. "You're expelling me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Carver sat back, a self-satisfied smile spreading across his face. "Effective immediately. Pack your things. You're no longer a student here." Her world tilted. She felt like she'd been punched in the stomach, the air knocked out of her lungs. "You can't do this," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't do anything wrong." Carver stood, towering over her. "I can and I have. This school has standards, and you've proven time and time again that you don't meet them." Aaliyah blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. She wouldn't cry in front of him. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She stood slowly, her knees trembling, and grabbed her backpack. As she turned to leave, she reached up and clutched the small gold necklace around her neck. It was warm against her skin, engraved with the initials MJ. The weight of it steadied her, gave her something to hold on to. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, without turning back. Carver chuckled, his voice dripping with condescension. "I don't think so." Aaliyah walked out of the office, her head held high despite the tears threatening to spill. The hallway was empty, eerily quiet. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and uneven, as she made her way to her locker. The weight of what just happened pressed down on her, but somewhere deep inside, a spark ignited. She wasn't going to let him win. Not like this. The sound of Alia's front door slamming echoed through the small house. She dropped her backpack by the couch and sank onto the worn cushions, her face buried in her hands. Her mom's soft humming drifted from the kitchen, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside Alia. "Alia?" Her mother's voice floated in, calm but curious. "Is that you, baby?" "Yeah, it's me," Alia mumbled, trying to steady her voice. Her mom appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. She was a petite woman with kind eyes, and an apron that looked older than Alia herself. "What's wrong?" she asked, tilting her head. "Did something happen at school?" Alia hesitated, her heart pounding. Her mom worked so hard to keep her in that school. How could she tell her? "It's nothing," she said quickly, her voice cracking. Her mom frowned, stepping closer. "Nothing doesn't make you look like that, Alia. Talk to me." Alia took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I got expelled," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Her mom froze, the towel slipping from her hands. "Expelled?" she repeated, as if the word didn't make sense. "What do you mean, expelled?" Alia looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. "Principal Carver, he said I broke some stupid rule, but I didn't do anything, Mom, I swear." Her mom sank onto the couch beside her, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for Alia's. "Oh, baby," she murmured, her voice heavy with disbelief. "Why would he do that?" "I don't know." Alia burst out, the frustration spilling over. "He just doesn't like me. He's always picking on me, always looking for a reason to get rid of me." Her mom's face tightened, the worry in her eyes replaced by a flicker of anger. "This isn't right," she said firmly. "We'll figure this out. You don't deserve this." Before Alia could respond, the front door creaked open again, and a familiar deep voice filled the room. "Is that my favorite niece I hear?" Alia's uncle, Marcus, stepped in, a wide grin on his face. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence filling the small room. He carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his sharp suit only slightly rumpled from travel. "Uncle Marcus." Alia jumped up, throwing her arms around him. For a moment, the weight of the day lifted. "Whoa, what's all this?" Marcus asked, pulling back to look at her. His smile faded as he saw her tear-streaked face. "What's going on?" Her mom sighed, standing up and crossing her arms. "Alia just told me she was expelled," she said, her voice tight. "Can you believe that?" Marcus's face darkened. "Expelled?" he repeated, his tone sharp. "For what?" Alia shook her head. "He said I broke some rule, but it's not true. He just wants me gone." Marcus was quiet for a moment, his jaw clenched. Then he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll handle it." Alia blinked up at him. "What do you mean?" He crouched down so they were eye level, his serious gaze meeting hers. "I mean, don't worry about Principal Carver," he said. "Just focus on being the amazing person you are. I'll take care of the rest." "But..." "No buts," Marcus interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Trust me." Alia wanted to believe him, but doubt lingered. How could he possibly fix this? That evening, the house was buzzing with quiet activity. Alia sat at the kitchen table, scribbling in her notebook, while her mom stirred a pot on the stove. Outside, the fading sunlight bathed the neighborhood in a golden glow. Their neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, peeked over the fence, her sharp eyes scanning the yard. "Everything all right over here?" she called out, her voice filled with concern, but edged with nosiness. "We're fine, Mrs. Jenkins," Alia's mom replied with a forced smile. "Just a long day." Mrs. Jenkins nodded knowingly, lingering a moment too long before retreating. Alia shook her head, smirking. "She probably knows I got expelled already," she muttered. Her mom gave her a small, weary smile. "She means well, I guess." The back door opened, and Marcus stepped in, carrying 2 pizza boxes. "Dinner's here," he announced, setting them on the counter. "Pizza?" Aliyah raised an eyebrow. "You never bring pizza." Marcus shrugged. "Figured we could all use a break. Besides, who says no to pepperoni?" They ate in the living room, the atmosphere lighter but still tinged with unspoken tension. Aliyah's mom finally broke the silence. "So, Marcus, what's your plan?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his face. "Don't worry about it," he said. "I've got connections. We'll get this sorted." Aliyah frowned. "What kind of connections?" He chuckled. "The kind that make things happen." His vague answer only deepened her curiosity, but she didn't push. There was something in his tone, a quiet confidence, that made her believe him. The next morning, Aliyah met her best friend, Maya, at the park. Maya was fiery and unapologetic, the kind of friend who always had her back. "Expelled? Are you kidding me?" Maya exclaimed, pacing back and forth. "That's insane. Carver's always been a jerk, but this..." "I know," Aliyah said, sitting on the swings. "I don't even know what to do." Maya stopped, her hands on her hips. "You fight back, that's what. Don't let him get away with this." Aliyah looked down, her fingers tracing the necklace around her neck. "Uncle Marcus says he'll handle it." "Handle it how?" Maya asked, her eyebrows raised. "Does he know someone on the board or something?" "Maybe," Aliyah said. "He didn't say much." Maya sighed, sitting beside her. "Well, if anyone can fix this, it's your uncle. That man's like a superhero." Aliyah smiled faintly. "Yeah, I hope you're right." As the day went on, the weight of uncertainty pressed down on Aliyah. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just her expulsion. Something about Marcus's demeanor, the way he seemed so calm and sure, made her wonder. That evening, she found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the quiet street. She sat beside him, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. "Uncle Marcus," she said hesitantly, "why are you so sure you can fix this?" He glanced at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "Because I know who I am," he said simply. Aliyah frowned. "What does that mean?" He looked away, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, Aliyah, people underestimate you. They think you're small, that you don't matter. But when the time comes, you show them who's really in charge." His words hung in the air, filling her with a strange mix of hope and curiosity. She didn't know what he meant exactly, but she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt all day: determination. The school board meeting room buzzed with murmurs. Rows of chairs faced a long oak table where the board members sat, their faces stern but expectant. Parents, teachers, and a few students filled the room, the tension almost suffocating. At the head of the table, Principal Carver stood, his presence commanding but smug, his hands clasped in front of him. "This meeting," Carver began, his voice smooth and confident, "has been called to address the matter of Miss Aliyah James and her violation of the school's zero-tolerance policy." Aliyah sat in the back row, flanked by her mother and her Uncle Marcus. She clenched her fists in her lap, her nails digging into her palms as Carver continued. Her mom leaned close, whispering, "Keep your head up, baby. We're here for you." Carver adjusted his tie, the fluorescent lights glinting off his glasses. "Our school has always upheld the highest standards," he said, glancing around the room. "And when a student fails to meet those standards, action must be taken." The crowd murmured. Aliyah's heart pounded in her chest. He gestured to a large screen behind him. A blurry image appeared, a grainy photo of Aliyah, supposedly in an altercation with another student. The angle was poor, the evidence flimsy. "This," Carver said, pointing to the screen, "is just one example of the disruptive behavior Miss James has exhibited." After careful consideration, the administration decided that her presence is no longer conducive to our learning environment. The murmurs grew louder. Aliyah felt a flush of heat rise to her face. "That's not true," she whispered fiercely. "That's not even me." Carver ignored the growing unrest, his voice unwavering. We understand this decision may seem harsh, but we must prioritize the integrity of our institution. Integrity? Marcus's deep voice sliced through the room like a blade. Every head turned. Marcus stood, his presence commanding as he walked to the front of the room, the sound of his polished shoes echoing off the walls. He carried a quiet confidence, his face calm but his eyes blazing. "Excuse me, sir," Carver said, clearly irritated. "This is a formal meeting. You'll have your turn to speak." "I'm speaking now," Marcus said sharply, cutting him off. The room went silent, the air crackling with tension. Carver's smug demeanor faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained it. "And who exactly are you?" Marcus smiled faintly, his gaze unflinching. "Marcus Johnson," he said, "major investor in this school." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Alia's eyes widened as she glanced at her mother, who looked just as stunned. Carver's face turned a shade paler. "Investor?" he repeated, his voice wavering slightly. "That's right," Marcus said, stepping closer. "I've poured a lot of time and money into this institution because I believe in its potential, but hearing how my niece has been treated, that stops today." The room erupted into murmurs again, louder this time. "Your niece?" Carver stammered, his composure slipping further. Marcus nodded. "Alia James is my niece," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "And I'm not here to let you railroad her with false accusations and thin evidence." This is highly inappropriate," Carver stuttered, trying to regain control. "We're following protocol." "Protocol?" Marcus's voice rose, cutting him off. "You call it protocol to single out a student, fabricate evidence, and ruin her future because she doesn't fit your idea of acceptable." Carver's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Marcus turned to the board members, his tone shifting to one of quiet authority. "Let me make this clear. I've reviewed the so-called evidence against Alia. It's flimsy at best. What's more concerning is the pattern I've discovered." The crowd hushed again. "What pattern?" one of the board members asked, her voice tentative. Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "Over the past 3 years, this school has expelled more minority students under this zero-tolerance policy than any other demographic. Coincidence? I don't think so." He handed the papers to the board members, who began flipping through them, their faces growing grim. "This isn't just about Alia," Marcus continued, his voice rising. "This is about a system that targets and silences students like her, students who have every right to be here." Carver's face turned red. "That's enough," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "You can't come in here and—" "I can," Marcus interrupted, his voice booming. "And I will." He turned back to the board, his expression serious. "I demand a full review of Alia's expulsion and an investigation into this so-called zero-tolerance policy. Until then, Alia stays." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Carver glared at Marcus, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You're overstepping," he said, his voice low. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "No, Carver, I'm holding you accountable." Flashbacks to Carver's pattern of bias. As Marcus spoke, the story cut to scenes of past injustices under Carver's leadership. A Latina student was scolded for speaking Spanish in the hallway. Her parents later told their daughter's behavior was disruptive. A black boy was suspended for defending himself in a fight, while the instigator walked free. A Muslim girl was reprimanded for wearing a headscarf deemed against the dress code. The images were stark, each one painting a clear picture of Carver's biased decisions. Back in the meeting room, Marcus leaned over the table, his voice steady but filled with righteous anger. "You've abused your power for too long, Carver, and it ends here." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them finally spoke. "We'll review the evidence and discuss next steps." "That's all I ask," Marcus said, stepping back. Carver's glare followed him as he returned to his seat. Alia looked at her uncle, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. As the meeting adjourned, Carver stormed out, his face a mask of fury. But Marcus didn't flinch. He simply placed a reassuring hand on Alia's shoulder. "We're just getting started," he said softly. Alia stared at the thick file Marcus had just dropped on the kitchen table. The air between them was heavy with unspoken tension. The folder's worn edges and creased papers hinted at its age. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Marcus leaned against the counter, his sharp eyes fixed on her. "Evidence," he said simply. "Evidence of what?" "Of a pattern," Marcus replied, his tone even but with a weight that sent a chill down her spine. He opened the folder, spreading out papers, photographs, and handwritten letters across the table. Alia's breath caught as she scanned them. There were old disciplinary reports, emails, and even a few grainy photos. "These are all students who've been expelled or punished by Carver over the years," Marcus explained. "Look at the names, the faces." Alia's brow furrowed as she flipped through the documents. One name stood out: Carlos Ramirez. "Carlos was a senior last year," she murmured. "He was expelled for fighting, but everyone knew he didn't start it." Marcus nodded. "And look at this," he said, pointing to another file. "Sophia Ahmed, suspended for wearing a hijab deemed disruptive." Alia's stomach churned as the pieces began to click. "He's been targeting people like me," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. Over the next few days, Marcus and Alia dived deeper into the files, reaching out to former students and staff who had crossed paths with Carver. One afternoon, they met with Carlos Ramirez in a small cafe. Carlos was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mix of frustration and determination. "I never had a chance," Carlos said, his voice bitter. "Carver didn't care about the truth. He just wanted me out of his school." "What happened?" Marcus asked, leaning forward intently. Carlos clenched his fists. "There was this fight in the hallway. Some guy shoved me, and when I pushed back, Carver showed up and blamed me. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. Said I was a bad influence." Alia's jaw tightened. "And no one stood up for you?" Carlos shook his head. "Not a single teacher. They were all too scared to cross him." Alia glanced at Marcus, who gave her a small nod. They were beginning to see the bigger picture. Later that evening, they visited Sophia Ahmed, who welcomed them into her home with a shy smile. Her parents hovered nearby, their expressions a mix of pride and caution. "Carver said my scarf was a political statement," Sophia explained, her voice trembling with old wounds. "He called me into his office one day and told me to take it off or face suspension." "And when you refused?" Marcus asked. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "He made my life miserable. Sent me home for violating the dress code. My parents had to pull me out of school." Alia's fists clenched. That's disgusting," she said, her voice breaking. Sophia nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "You're lucky to have someone like him," she said, nodding toward Marcus. "Fight back. Don't let him win." As the testimonials piled up, Marcus and Alia felt the momentum shifting in their favor. But Carver wasn't going down without a fight. One morning, Marcus received an anonymous message: "Back off or you'll regret it." He showed it to Alia, his expression unreadable. "He's trying to scare us," he said. Alia swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Marcus smiled faintly. "We keep going." But it wasn't just threats. Several of the former students they contacted began backing out, their fear of retaliation outweighing their desire for justice. "I can't," Carlos said over the phone, his voice tight. "I have a job now, a family to think about. I'm sorry." Sophia's parents called later that evening. "We've decided not to pursue this," her father said, his tone firm but regretful. "It's too risky." Alia's heart sank with each call, but Marcus remained unshaken. "They're scared," he told her, "and they have every right to be, but we're not stopping." For Alia, the fight was personal. She started spending every spare moment going through the files, connecting dots and building their case. One night, as Marcus sat at his laptop typing up notes, Aaliyah approached him, holding a photograph. It was an old picture of a group of students standing in front of the school. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a man standing off to the side. Marcus squinted. "Is that Mr. Clarkson?" Aaliyah nodded. "He used to teach history. He left a couple of years ago, but everyone loved him. He might know something." The next day, they tracked down Mr. Clarkson at a local library. He greeted them warmly but seemed hesitant when they brought up Carver. "That man was a nightmare," Clarkson admitted, lowering his voice. "He ruled with an iron fist. Most of us didn't agree with his methods, but, Marcus prompted. Clarkson sighed. "But speaking out would have cost us our jobs. I have a family to support." Aaliyah leaned forward. "Please, Mr. Clarkson, we need your help. If we don't stop him, he'll just keep doing this." Clarkson hesitated, then nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll tell you what I know." With Clarkson's testimony and the growing pile of evidence, Marcus and Aaliyah began preparing for a formal presentation to the school board. But Carver wasn't done. Aaliyah noticed strangers lingering near her house, their cars idling just a little too long. Marcus's emails were hacked, and several key documents disappeared. One night, their house phone rang. Marcus answered, his voice sharp. "Hello." There was silence on the other end, followed by a low voice. "You're making a mistake." Marcus hung up, his jaw tight. "Uncle Marcus," Aaliyah said, her voice shaking. What if they hurt us?" He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They won't," he said firmly. "Bullies only win if you let them scare you. And we're not scared." The night before the board meeting, Aaliyah couldn't sleep. She sat on her bed, clutching her necklace, the initials MJ glinting in the moonlight. Marcus knocked softly on her door. "Ready for tomorrow?" She nodded, though her stomach churned with nerves. "What if they don't listen?" "They will," Marcus said, "because we're telling the truth, and the truth always comes out." But as he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. He picked it up, his face darkening as he read the message. "What is it?" Aaliyah asked. Marcus hesitated, then showed her the screen. The message read, "You won't make it to the meeting." The fight for justice had just become a fight for survival. The morning sunlight poured through the school's tall windows, casting long, golden streaks across the hallway. Aaliyah stood in front of her locker, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, their whispers grazing her like sharp thorns. "She's back," one girl muttered, not bothering to lower her voice. "I heard it's only temporary," another chimed in. Aaliyah tightened her grip on her books, refusing to let their words sink in. She knew she shouldn't expect a warm welcome after everything that had happened, but it still stung. Principal Carver's announcement that her expulsion had been suspended pending review was less a victory and more a calculated retreat. Aaliyah could see it in the way he avoided her in the hallways, his stiff smile a poor mask for the hatred simmering beneath. "Hey," Maya's voice broke through her thoughts. Her best friend jogged up, her curly hair bouncing with every step. "Ignore them," she said firmly. "They're just mad because you're braver than they'll ever be." Aaliyah managed a small smile. "Thanks, Maya." Maya leaned closer, lowering her voice. "But seriously, don't let your guard down. Carver's not done with you. Not by a long shot." Aaliyah nodded, her resolve hardening. "I know," she said, "and I'm ready." For the next few days, things felt almost normal. Aaliyah kept her head down, focusing on her classes and trying to block out the whispers and side glances. Marcus had assured her that the review process was moving forward and that Carver was under increasing scrutiny from the school board. At dinner one evening, Marcus shared the news. "The board is starting to ask questions," he said, his tone calm but laced with satisfaction. "Carver's losing his grip." Alia's mom smiled for the first time in days. "That's wonderful," she said, reaching for Alia's hand. "You'll have your chance to clear your name." Alia looked at her uncle. What if he tries something else? Marcus's eyes narrowed. Then we'll be ready. But beneath his confidence, Alia sensed an edge of caution. He knew Carver wouldn't go down without a fight. The first sign of trouble came a week later. Alia was sitting in the library, trying to focus on her homework, when her phone buzzed with a news alert. She opened the link, her eyes widening as she read the headline. "Investor accused of corruption. Marcus Johnson under investigation." Her heart dropped. She read the article quickly, her hands trembling. It claimed that Marcus had been involved in shady business deals and used his wealth to manipulate the school system. "This can't be real," she whispered. Maya leaned over, reading the article on Alia's phone. "This is Carver," she said angrily. "It has to be. He's trying to take your uncle down." Alia's mind raced. If people believe this, Marcus's credibility and their fight for justice would be destroyed. At home, the atmosphere was tense. Marcus sat at the dining table, his phone buzzing with calls and messages. Alia's mom paced the kitchen, her worry etched on her face. "Who's behind this?" Alia demanded, slamming her bag on the floor. Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's a smear campaign," he said. "Carver's desperate, and this is how he fights." "Can't we prove it's fake?" Alia asked. "We will," Marcus said, his voice firm. "But until then, this could hurt us." The next day at school, things were worse. The whispers had turned into outright hostility. "She's only here because her uncle paid someone off," a boy sneered as Alia walked past. "Guess corruption runs in the family," another added, loud enough for her to hear. Alia's face burned, but she kept walking, her head high. She refused to let them see her break. Even Maya seemed distant, her usual fiery support dimmed. At lunch, she hesitated before sitting down next to Alia. "I don't care what they're saying," Maya said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "You believe them, don't you?" Alia asked, her voice shaking. Maya shook her head. "No, it's just, people are scared, you know. They don't want to get caught in the middle." Alia stared at her, feeling the sting of betrayal. "You're supposed to be my best friend." "I am," Maya said, but her voice wavered. I don't know how to help." Alia stood, grabbing her tray. "Then maybe you should figure it out," she said, walking away. At home, Marcus was dealing with the fallout. Reporters camped outside the house, their questions invasive and relentless. "Mr. Johnson, care to comment on the allegations? Are you stepping down from the board? Did you pay to overturn your niece's expulsion?" Marcus ignored them, his expression steely as he closed the door behind him. Inside, Alia watched him with a mix of admiration and worry. "How can you stay so calm?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Because I've been here before," he said, "and I've learned that the truth always comes out." "But what if it doesn't?" Alia asked, her voice trembling. Marcus knelt in front of her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It will," he said firmly, "because we won't stop fighting." That night, Alia couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk, staring at the papers and files Marcus had collected. She felt the weight of their fight pressing down on her. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Give up, or you'll regret it." Her heart raced as she stared at the screen. She wanted to show Marcus, but something stopped her. She didn't want to burden him any more than he already was. Instead, she took a deep breath and typed a reply. "I'm not scared of you." She hit send, her hands shaking. The next morning, as Alia walked into school, she noticed something different. The usual buzz of conversation had been replaced by an uneasy silence. She reached her locker and found a note taped to it. "Last warning, back off." Her hands trembled as she crumpled the note, her eyes scanning the hallway. Carver's game was getting more dangerous, but Alia wasn't about to back down. She turned, her jaw set, and headed to the principal's office. It was time to confront him directly. The fight was far from over. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above as Aliyah sat in the library, a notebook spread open before her. Her pencil tapped nervously against the edge of the desk. The space was almost empty, save for a few students whispering at the far corner. She couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest, a weight that had been growing ever since Marcus was dragged into Carver's schemes. Her eyes flicked to her phone screen, where the headline accusing her uncle of corruption still blazed brightly. Her blood boiled every time she saw it, but today there was something different stirring inside her: determination. "This isn't just about me," she muttered under her breath. "This is about all of us." That evening, Aliyah sat at her dining table, surrounded by a stack of papers, her laptop, and her phone. She'd spent hours going through old files, revisiting the stories of students like Carlos and Sofia. A spark had ignited in her, a need to do something that went beyond fighting her own battle. She grabbed her phone and texted Maya. "Aliyah, I'm organizing a protest. Are you in?" The reply came almost instantly. "Maya, you know I'm always in. What's the plan?" Aliyah smiled for the first time that day. She opened her notebook, scribbling ideas furiously. The next morning, Aliyah stood outside the school gates with Maya at her side. They handed out flyers to students as they walked in, some taking them with curiosity, others with hesitation. "What's this?" one boy asked, unfolding the paper. "It's a call for justice," Aliyah said firmly. "We're standing up against Principal Carver and his unfair policies." The boy frowned but tucked the flyer into his bag. Maya leaned closer. "Not bad," she whispered, "but we need more than students." Aliyah nodded. "Parents, teachers, anyone who's been hurt by Carver or knows someone who has." She stepped away, pulling out her phone. With shaking fingers, she uploaded a post to the school's community page. "We've been silent for too long. It's time to stand together against the injustices at our school. Join us for a protest this Friday at 3 p.m. in front of the school. Share your stories, be heard." As she hit post, a wave of nervous energy washed over her. This was bold, but bold was what they needed. The days leading up to the protest were a whirlwind. Stories began pouring in through comments, private messages, and even anonymous notes slipped into Aliyah's locker. One parent messaged her directly. "My daughter was expelled last year for speaking up against a teacher's bias. We'll be there." A former student commented, "Carver made my life miserable. I'll share my story." Even a few current teachers, speaking in cautious whispers, expressed their support. But the most surprising message came late one evening. Aliyah was sitting in her room, scrolling through emails when she saw the subject line, "I can help." It was from a name she recognized instantly, Mr. Clarkson, the history teacher who had left the school years ago. She clicked the message, her eyes widening as she read. "I've been waiting for someone brave enough to take Carver on. I have recordings from when I worked there. Things he said in private that would shock everyone. If you're serious about this fight, I'm in." Aliyah's heart raced. She immediately forwarded the email to Marcus with a note, "We have a new ally." Friday arrived faster than Aliyah expected. By 3 p.m., a crowd had gathered outside the school, their voices a mix of excitement, anger, and determination. Students held signs with bold messages, "Justice for all students," "End the bias," "Carver must go." Parents stood in clusters, their faces serious but supportive. Maya walked among the crowd, handing out water bottles and rallying spirits. Aliyah stepped onto the makeshift stage, a small platform borrowed from the drama department. Her heart pounded as she faced the sea of faces, but she forced herself to speak. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been silenced, mistreated, or forced out by Carver's unfair policies. Today, we're making our voices heard." The crowd erupted in cheers. One by one, people came forward to share their stories. Carlos spoke about his unjust expulsion. Sophia's father recounted how their family had to fight for her dignity. Each testimony added fuel to the fire, the crowd's energy growing with every word. Toward the end of the protest, Mr. Clarkson stepped forward. The crowd hushed as the former teacher climbed onto the stage, holding a small digital recorder in his hand. "My name is Daniel Clarkson," he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I worked at this school for 10 years. I saw things, heard things, that I didn't speak out against because I was scared. But today, I'm done being silent." He pressed play on the recorder, and Carver's voice crackled through the speakers. "This school needs to stay elite," Carver's voice sneered. "We don't need kids like her bringing down our reputation. If I have to bend the rules to keep our standards high, so be it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Another recording played. "Why should I care about some parent complaining? They can take their sob story somewhere else. This is my school, and I'll run it how I see fit." The crowd erupted in outrage. By the end of the protest, news cameras had arrived, reporters shoving microphones toward Aliyah and Marcus. "This is about more than one student," Aliyah said firmly, her voice carrying over the chaos. "It's about holding people in power accountable and creating a school where everyone is treated fairly." Her words made headlines the next day. Articles praised the bravery of the students and parents who stood up against systemic injustice. Marcus's name, once tarnished by Carver's smear campaign, was now associated with the fight for change. As the protest ended and the crowd began to disperse, Aliyah stood with Marcus, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You did good today," Marcus said, his voice filled with pride. "We did good," Aliyah corrected, smiling up at him. But their moment of triumph was cut short as a black car pulled up to the curb. A man in a suit stepped out, his expression unreadable. "Marcus Johnson?" he asked, holding up a badge. "We need to talk." Marcus's face hardened. "What is this about?" The man's gaze flicked to Aliyah. "It's about your involvement in today's events, and a new complaint filed against you." Aliyah's heart sank as Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. The fight was far from over. "You better have something important," Carver sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. He sat at the head of the polished oak table in the school boardroom, flanked by nervous board members and stacks of paperwork. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a cold glare on the room. Marcus leaned forward, his face calm but deadly serious. "Oh, I do," he said, his voice low and steady. "And by the time I'm done, even you won't be able to deny what you've done." The tension in the room was palpable, the kind that made the air feel thick and heavy. Aliyah sat a few rows back, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Marcus, who radiated quiet confidence, and then at Carver, whose smug demeanor was starting to crack. The boardroom was packed. Parents, students, teachers, and even reporters squeezed into the small space. The air buzzed with whispers and the soft rustling of papers. Aliyah scanned the room, her stomach twisting in knots. She could see the faces of those who had suffered under Carver's rule, Carlos, Sophia, and even some parents she didn't recognize. Their expressions ranged from anger to hope, and she felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. "This is it," she whispered to Maya, who sat beside her. Maya nodded, her jaw tight. "Yeah, let's hope Marcus has enough to bury him." Carver tapped a pen against the table, the sharp sound echoing in the room. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "you've made some colorful accusations, but unless you have actual proof, this meeting is a waste of everyone's time." Marcus's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Oh, I have proof," he said. "Plenty of it." He stood, pulling a small USB drive from his pocket. "This," he said, holding it up, "contains recordings from a former teacher, Mr. Clarkson. Recordings of you, Mr. Carver." The room fell silent. Carver's face twitched, but he quickly composed himself. "Recordings?" he scoffed. "Of what?" "Me doing my job." Marcus's smile widened. "Let's find out." He inserted the USB into a laptop connected to the projector. The screen flickered to life, and Carver's voice filled the room. "This school needs to stay elite." The recording played. "We don't need kids like her dragging us down." Gasps rippled through the room. Carver's eyes darted around, his confidence visibly shaken. "This is taken out of context," he stammered. "Let's try another one," Marcus said, clicking to the next file. "If I have to bend the rules to keep troublemakers out, so be it. They don't belong here anyway." The whispers turned into murmurs, growing louder with every word. Marcus paused the recording, turning to face the board. "These comments are bad enough," he said, his voice steady but filled with righteous anger. "But it doesn't stop there." He clicked to a new folder. "This," he said, pointing to the screen, "is a detailed financial audit of the school's accounts over the past 5 years." One of the board members frowned. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," Marcus said. "I'm stating a fact. Carver has been diverting school funds, money meant for students and resources, into private accounts. His private accounts." The room erupted. Parents shouted questions, teachers exchanged shocked glances, and reporters furiously typed notes. "This is absurd," Carver yelled, standing so quickly that his chair toppled over. "You have no proof." Marcus clicked another file. "Bank statements," he said calmly. "Transactions linked directly to your name. Would you like me to read them out loud?" Carver's face turned beet red. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted. "You're trying to ruin me." "No," Marcus said, his voice cold. "You ruined yourself." Aaliyah watched, her heart racing as Marcus laid out the evidence piece by piece. He showed emails where Carver had approved unnecessary expenses that funneled money to shell companies. He presented testimonies from staff who had been pressured to stay silent. And then he dropped the final piece of the puzzle. "This," Marcus said, holding up a printed document, "is a report from the State Education Board. It confirms that Carver's practices have violated multiple ethical and legal standards." The room was silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Carver's shoulders slumped, his bluster deflated. This is all lies," he muttered weakly. But the damage was done. As Marcus returned to his seat, Aaliyah felt a surge of pride and emotion. She stood, her legs trembling but her voice steady. "I was expelled because of him," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "Not because I broke a rule, but because I didn't fit his idea of what a student should be. But I'm not the only one. He's hurt so many people, and we've all had enough." The crowd erupted in applause, their support washing over her like a wave. The board members conferred in hushed voices, their expressions grave. Finally, the chairwoman stood, her gaze fixed on Carver. "Mr. Carver," she said, her voice cold, "you are hereby placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Security will escort you off the premises." Carver's face twisted with fury. "You can't do this," he shouted, but his protests fell on deaf ears. As security approached, he shot Marcus a venomous glare. "This isn't over," he hissed. Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "You're right," he said. "It's just the beginning." The section ends with Carver being led out, the crowd buzzing with relief and anticipation. But the fight is far from over, and the stakes are higher than ever. The room was a storm. Voices rang out, angry, defiant, and full of disbelief. Principal Carver stood in front of the school board, his face a mask of fury and shame. Behind him, the walls seemed to close in, his empire, once secure, now crumbling with every passing second. The board members exchanged uncertain glances, their eyes flickering between the evidence Marcus had presented and the angry crowd of students, parents, and teachers gathered outside. Carver's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, his breath shallow. His voice cut through the chaos like a whip. "This is a conspiracy," he spat, his words sharp as daggers. These allegations are nothing but lies. I have built this school into what it is today, and you think I would destroy it for? Enough. Marcus's voice, deep and unwavering, sliced through Carver's rant. Everyone in the room fell silent. Aliyah sat in the back, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would define the future of this school. The past few weeks had been a blur, protests, meetings, accusations, and now, here they were, on the edge of victory or defeat. Marcus stood tall at the front of the room, his presence calm but filled with raw power. Carver sneered at him, his eyes burning with malice. "You're nothing more than a puppet," he growled. "You think you can change anything? You're just as weak as they are." He pointed toward Aliyah, the accusation hanging in the air like a poisonous cloud. Marcus didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unwavering. He looked at the room, his voice rising with quiet authority. "This," he said, gesturing to Carver, "this is what happens when power goes unchecked. When people are allowed to manipulate the system for their own gain, and we let them get away with it." His voice grew louder, more impassioned. "But it's not just about me or Carver. It's about the thousands of students who've been lied to, silenced, and hurt by a system that's supposed to protect them. Today, we stop that." Aliyah's heart swelled. Marcus's words were more than just a speech. They were a declaration, an unstoppable force, like the calm before a storm finally breaking. "I'm done," Carver hissed, his eyes wide with desperation. "This is my school. You can't take it from me." Carver turned and began to march toward the door. The board members were still reeling from Marcus's speech, too shocked to react. Carver's hand gripped the door handle, but before he could escape, Marcus moved like lightning. "Not so fast," Marcus said, stepping into his path, his voice like ice. Carver froze, his eyes flicking to Marcus, then to the two security guards stationed at the back of the room. He made a move to push past, but the guards stepped forward, blocking his way. "What do you think you're doing?" Carver spat, his face twisted with fury. "You can't just." "Actually, we can," one of the security guards said, his voice steady. "We've been informed to place you under arrest, Principal Carver. You're under investigation for corruption, misuse of funds, and unethical conduct." The room fell into stunned silence. Aliyah's breath caught in her throat. It was happening. Carver, the man who had tormented her, was being held accountable. She could barely believe it. "No, no, this isn't over," Carver screamed, trying to push past the guards, his voice rising to a frenzy. "You'll regret this. I'll destroy you all." But as he struggled, the security guards calmly restrained him, cuffing his hands behind his back. Carver's eyes blazed with pure rage, but the fight had gone out of him. He was powerless now. Marcus stepped forward, his face still calm, but with a fire burning in his eyes. "Justice is never easy," he said, addressing the room, "but it's necessary. And for too long, this school has turned a blind eye to the truth. We've allowed a man like Carver to manipulate the system, to tear down students like Aliyah, and to profit off their suffering." Aliyah's heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. She had always known there was something wrong with how things were run here, but hearing it from Marcus, hearing it all laid out so simply, made the truth burn like acid in her chest. "I won't stop here," Marcus continued. "This isn't just about Carver. It's about the entire system that let him do this. This school, this community, needs change, real change." He turned to face the board members, his gaze unwavering. "We need new leadership, we need accountability, and we need to make sure that no student ever feels like they don't belong here because of who they are." The board members looked around at each other, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in their eyes. They had seen the evidence. They had heard the stories. They knew what they had to do. One of the board members, a woman with short dark hair and glasses, stood up, her voice clear and resolute. "We've failed in our duty to protect the students," she said, "and now we must act. We will vote to remove Carver from his position, effective immediately. And we will begin the process of reforming the system to make sure this never happens again." The room erupted in applause. The weight of the decision hung in the air, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a victory for what was right. Alia felt her chest swell with pride. She had fought for this moment, and it was finally here. Carver was led out of the room in handcuffs, his protests falling on deaf ears. As the security guards escorted him out, Alia's eyes followed him, her heart pounding. She couldn't believe it was finally over. Marcus turned to her, his eyes softening as he saw the look on her face. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. Alia smiled, the weight in her chest lifting. "We did it," she corrected him. For a moment, they stood there, together in the victory they had earned through sweat, tears, and an unrelenting pursuit of justice. But as they left the boardroom, Marcus's phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen, his face falling. "What is it?" Alia asked, her stomach tightening. Marcus's jaw clenched. "It's just the beginning," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We've won this battle, but there's still a long way to go." Alia nodded, her heart thumping in her chest. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like they had a real chance. As they walked toward the exit, the sound of flashing cameras filled the air. The press was swarming, eager to get their shots, their questions. But suddenly, a voice rose above the noise, sharp and commanding. "Stop right there." Alia turned, her heart skipping a beat. Standing at the door was someone she didn't expect to see, someone she hadn't thought of in weeks. It was her mother, standing tall and proud, her expression filled with determination. Behind her were several other parents, each one of them with their own story, their own fight to tell. Elia's mother stepped forward, her voice loud and clear for everyone to hear. "We will not stop until every student in this school is treated fairly. This is just the beginning." And Alia knew, in that moment, that the battle they had fought wasn't just for her, or for Marcus. It was for all the students who had been silenced for far too long. The fight was far from over, but now they had the power to win. The auditorium was packed, buzzing with excitement and tension. Alia sat with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her heart hammering in her chest. The once cold and indifferent atmosphere of the school now felt different, charged, alive with energy, the kind of energy that only came after a fight for something real, something just. The principal's office was a distant memory now, a mere shadow in the past. Today, the world was changing, and Alia was right in the center of it. "Please welcome, Alia James," the principal announced from the stage, his voice trembling just slightly, as if unsure of his own words. Alia's name rang through the speakers, echoing in her ears. She stood up, her legs feeling a bit like jelly beneath her. The spotlight hit her as she walked down the aisle, but her focus wasn't on the cameras or the crowd. It was on one person, her uncle Marcus, who sat quietly in the back, his presence as solid as ever. He gave her a single nod, his expression proud but unreadable. It was his way of saying, "You've earned this." Alia took her place on the stage, her gaze sweeping over the audience. She could see the faces of students, teachers, parents, all eyes on her. Some were eager for the change she promised, others skeptical. She swallowed hard. The spotlight burned, but in it, she saw clarity. She saw hope. "You're not alone," she reminded herself quietly. The microphone felt heavy in her hand. The words she had practiced over and over in her mind now seemed almost foreign, unsure in the face of reality. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Thank you," Alia began, her voice stronger than she felt. "Thank you to all of you who believed in what's right, who stood by me when it felt like the world was against us." Her heart raced. This was the moment that could define everything. The moment when all the hard work, the protests, the struggles, and the long nights spent fighting for justice would culminate into something more powerful than any one individual. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced. Aaliyah looked at the faces in the crowd, students who had been scared to speak out, parents who had fought for their children, teachers who had been quietly supportive but afraid to act. Today, they were all part of this change. When I first stood here, I was told that I didn't belong, she continued, her voice gaining strength. I was told that I wasn't good enough for this school, but I am good enough. We all are. And this school, our community, we are better than the hatred and fear that tried to hold us back. The audience was silent. She could feel the weight of their attention, the gravity of the moment. This was her fight, her victory. But it wasn't just hers. It was for everyone who had suffered under an unjust system, for those who had stayed silent for too long. I'm not here to thank the people who tried to destroy me. I'm here to thank the people who fought beside me. I'm here to thank you for believing in something better, in something real. There was a pause, and then the applause began, slow at first, tentative, then swelling into a roar that filled every corner of the auditorium. Aaliyah closed her eyes, taking in the sound of it, the sound of victory, of justice, of change. After the applause died down, Aaliyah stepped down from the stage, her feet light, as if she were walking on air. She made her way through the crowd, towards Marcus. He stood, waiting for her. His expression was the same as always, stoic, measured, but there was something behind his eyes now. Pride. She stopped in front of him. I didn't do this alone, she said, her voice quieter now, filled with gratitude. I couldn't have done this without you. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. You did all the hard work, he said, his voice low but full of meaning. You showed everyone what true courage looks like. Aaliyah smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but a smile of understanding. For the first time, she realized just how far she had come, how far they had both come. She wasn't just Marcus's niece anymore. She was a symbol of something larger, something powerful. You're not done yet, Marcus continued, his gaze steady. This is just the beginning. Your voice, our voices, will keep ringing through this school and beyond. Aaliyah nodded, feeling the weight of his words. The battle had been won, but the war for justice would continue, and she would be there, fighting for every student, every person who had ever been made to feel less than. Weeks passed, but the change was undeniable. The school was slowly becoming something new. The policies had been rewritten, the leadership reshuffled. Carver was gone, his name erased from the school's history. In his place stood a new, diverse team of educators and administrators, each committed to ensuring that every student had a voice. The reforms were sweeping. No longer would students be expelled for reasons as vague as disruptive behavior or attitude. A new focus was placed on inclusivity, on teaching students to think critically about the world around them. There were programs in place for students who needed extra support, and for the first time, students felt like they mattered. But the most important change was the culture, the unspoken feeling that things were different now. The students who had once felt invisible were now seen. They had a voice. They had power. Aaliyah's influence reached beyond the walls of the school. Her story made headlines. Other schools began to take notice, asking what they could do to ensure a safer, more inclusive environment for their students. She became a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt marginalized, a reminder that one voice could make all the difference. One afternoon, Marcus called Aaliyah into his office. It was the same office she had once sat in, unsure of what her future held. But now, it felt different. It felt like home. She walked in and closed the door behind her. "What's up?" she asked, sitting down across from him. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. "You've done something incredible," he said. "You've changed this school, and in doing so, you've changed the future of so many students who will come after you." Aaliyah smiled, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice soft. Marcus nodded. "You've got a gift. And that gift, your voice, is something you'll carry with you forever. This is just the beginning, Aaliyah. There's a lot more work to be done." "I know," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "And I'll keep fighting. For everyone who needs someone to speak for them." Marcus smiled then, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. "I'll be right behind you, every step of the way." Aaliyah walked out of the office and stood by the window, looking out at the school grounds. She thought about everything they had been through, the struggles, the fears, the moments when she thought it might all be too much. But now, standing here, she knew that she had changed something, that she had made a difference. And as she looked out at the students passing by, she realized that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, she knew that she wasn't alone, and neither were they. With a deep breath, Aaliyah turned away from the window and walked forward, for justice, for equality, for every voice that had been silenced. The fight would continue, and she would be there to lead it.